The United Nations General Assembly has long stood as the symbolic stage where leaders from every corner of the globe gather to voice their visions, their grievances, and their hopes for the international order. Yet, in its history, few speeches have ever carried the intensity, defiance, and ripple effect of the one delivered by Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré. Though swiftly banned from circulation in many official UN outlets, the address nonetheless spread like wildfire, reaching the ears of millions and leaving an indelible impact across Africa, shaking 43 nations in ways the international community could scarcely ignore. At the heart of Traoré's banned speech was an unflinching critique of the global power imbalance that has defined Africa's position on the world stage for decades. He confronted the very institution in which he stood, accusing it of perpetuating a system where African nations are treated not as equal sovereign states, but as pawns in the geopolitical games of larger powers. With raw conviction, he argued that the post-colonial promise of independence has never truly been realized, as economic dependency, military interference, and cultural manipulation continue to bind the continent to old masters. His words rang as both an accusation and a declaration of emancipation. Observers in the assembly hall recall a palpable tension as Traoré raised his voice against the hypocrisy of global governance. He asked why, after years of promises, Africa remained systematically marginalized in trade negotiations, denied permanent representation in the Security Council, and pushed into debt traps under the guise of development loans. He challenged the narrative that Africa requires guidance from external institutions, insisting instead that the continent holds within itself the creativity, resources, and leadership to chart its own future. By daring to speak so directly, he not only defied diplomatic etiquette, but also struck a chord with leaders and citizens across Africa who felt their frustrations finally articulated on the world stage. The decision to suppress the speech only magnified its impact. UN media platforms released carefully edited summaries, but the full content was deliberately withheld. Yet, in an era where digital networks transcend official gatekeeping, recordings and transcripts quickly spread across social media and African news outlets. What had been intended as a silenced moment instead became a clarion call. In capitals from Dakar to Nairobi, in villages across the Sahel, and in universities from Lagos to Addis Ababa, people gathered to watch, listen, and debate. The fact that it was banned only intensified its legitimacy, reinforcing the sense that Traoré had spoken a forbidden truth. In West Africa, where Traoré's leadership already carries symbolic weight due to Burkina Faso's resistance against foreign influence, the speech was greeted with thunderous approval. Citizens viewed it not only as a defense of Burkina Faso, but as a defense of African dignity itself. In Ghana, Nigeria, Mali, and Senegal, youth movements seized upon the speech to galvanize their own calls for reform. For many, it was more than rhetoric. It was a manifesto of resistance against neocolonial systems that still linger under the surface of international relations. Across North Africa, the reactions were more complex, but no less significant. In Egypt and Morocco, commentators debated the geopolitical consequences of aligning with such a bold position, while citizens resonated with the themes of sovereignty and self-determination. Even in countries with strong Western ties, the authenticity of Traoré's words found resonance among the younger generation, who increasingly reject inherited political alignments in favor of an African-first vision. In sub-Saharan Africa, the emotional impact was overwhelming. Leaders in Mali and Niger, already aligned with Burkina Faso in regional defense initiatives, applauded Traoré's courage. In Congo and Chad, where political instability often intersects with foreign intervention, citizens voiced their admiration for his willingness to expose the contradictions of international policy. By the time the speech had circulated through 43 African nations, it had become more than an address. It was perceived as a collective voice for the continent. Yet, the speech also ignited fierce controversy. In the halls of the UN, diplomats from Western powers described it as inflammatory and destabilizing, accusing Traoré of undermining international cooperation. Some African governments, wary of straining relations with their traditional allies, distanced themselves publicly, even as their populations praised him. This split revealed a widening gap between African leaders and their citizens, with Traoré embodying the aspirations of the latter. The result was not just a political statement, but the crystallization of a generational divide in African politics between an older class tied to global powers and a younger movement demanding true independence. Central to Traoré's speech was a vision of African unity. He argued that the continent could no longer afford to function as fragmented states, easily manipulated by stronger nations. Instead, he proposed that Africa harness its shared resources, invest in cross-border infrastructure, and develop an internal market insulated from exploitative global trade. By calling for collective defense pacts, food sovereignty, and technology-driven innovation, he painted a picture of an Africa that thrives by standing together rather than leaning outward. Such a message resonated particularly in regions scarred by foreign-backed conflicts, where unity is seen as the only path to lasting peace. The power of the speech lay not only in its content, but in the manner of its delivery. Traoré spoke without hesitation, without reading from a script prepared by diplomats, and without tempering his tone to appease global sensitivities. His raw authenticity contrasted sharply with the carefully measured rhetoric that typically fills UN debates. This break from protocol signaled that he was not speaking merely as a head of state, but as a representative of African peoplehood. For many, it was precisely this unfiltered honesty that made the speech impossible to forget. In the aftermath, analysts debated the long-term implications. Would Traoré's defiance isolate Burkina Faso on the international stage, cutting it off from much-needed financial and political support? Or would it mark the beginning of a new African awakening, where other leaders feel emboldened to reject dependency and chart their own course? While opinions differed, one reality was undeniable. The speech had shaken the continent, inspiring debates in parliaments, universities, and communities in over 40 nations. The banned words had escaped their intended burial and instead ignited a movement. The story of Traoré's banned speech is therefore not merely about one leader's defiance, but about the broader struggle for Africa's place in the world. It illustrates how a single act of courage can break through decades of silence, forcing uncomfortable truths into the global conversation. It reveals the hunger across the continent for voices that articulate sovereignty, pride, and determination without compromise. And it demonstrates how even attempts at censorship cannot extinguish ideas whose time has come. As the echoes of that speech continue to reverberate, the legacy of the moment grows. Ibrahim Traoré may have stood alone at the podium of the United Nations, but in that act he became a vessel for the collective frustrations and aspirations of millions. The banning of his words only amplified their resonance, proving once more that truth has a way of finding its audience. For 43 African nations, it was a moment of recognition, a reminder that Africa's voice can shake the foundations of even the most powerful global institutions. And for the world at large, it was a warning that the era of dismissing Africa's demands for dignity and equality may finally be drawing to a close.